In the autumn of 1872, London was a city possessed by contradiction. It was, without question, the greatest empire the world had ever known. Yet within its very heart, in the streets that radiated outward from its grand institutions, there lived a world that the architects of empire preferred not to see. These were the streets of the poor. Not the genteel poor, those who maintained respectability despite hardship, but the actual poor. The people who existed in the margins, in the spaces between the grand Victorian facade and the pavement beneath. To understand London in 1870, one must first understand that it was not one city. It was, in fact, dozens of cities, occupying the same geographical space, but existing in completely separate moral universes. There was the London of Parliament and banking. There was the London of trade and commerce, and there was the London of survival. The population of London in the 1870s was approximately 3 million people. By some estimates, nearly 1 million of them lived in conditions that would be classified, even by the generous standards of the era, as squalid. 1 million human beings compressed into neighborhoods so dense, so poorly constructed, so bereft of light and air, that disease moved through them like a living thing. These were the slums, names like Whitechapel, Bethnal Green, Seven Dials, Limehouse, each a world unto itself, each with its own economy, its own rules, its own particular flavors of misery. Let us begin with the morning. For in the morning, the machinery of survival started again, as it did every day, driven by the ancient law of want. Thousands of men, women and children emerged from their rooms, spaces so small that a modern person would struggle to imagine voluntarily entering them, and stepped into the street with a single question in their minds: how will I eat today? Work, when it could be found, was brutal and paid almost nothing. A man might earn 6pence a day, perhaps 4 shillings a week, for 10 or 12 hours of labour. A woman earned half that. A child earned a quarter of that. This was not the agricultural poverty of the countryside, where at least there was soil and sky. This was industrial poverty, systematic, mechanical, dehumanizing. The factories that employed these people were themselves something new in the world. They represented a kind of organized efficiency that previous eras could not have conceived of. But this efficiency was purchased with something. It was purchased with human life, spent in increments, like currency. The air in these factories, the air that these workers breathed for 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day, was not air as you or I might understand it. It was thick with lint, with dust, with fibers that lodged in the lungs and never left. The smell was of oil, sweat, and something acrid that burned the nostrils. By afternoon, many would have had nothing to eat since the previous evening. Perhaps some had been given a thin broth by a workplace, most had not. They worked on will and habit, and the primitive terror that if they did not work, they would not survive the week. For those without factory work, and that was the majority, the day was a search through the city for work that might not exist, dock work, and if you could get to the docks before the gangs filled the positions. Cleaning work for those who could prove they had references. Street vending if you had the capital to buy goods to sell. Or, for many, theft. Theft in Victorian London was not romantic. It was not the domain of clever rogues from literature. It was the theft of desperate people stealing what they needed to survive. And London's criminal justice system, for all its claims to civilization and order, dealt with such crimes with surprising ferocity. A child could be transported to Australia for stealing a loaf of bread. A woman could be imprisoned for shoplifting a ribbon. The homes where the poor lived, if home is even the word for such places, were constructed with a kind of deliberate economy that bordered on the sadistic. A typical tenement building might house 200 people in spaces that should have held 30. The rooms were small, windowless, or nearly so. The walls wept moisture constantly. Disease lived in such places as naturally as people did. Sanitation in these neighborhoods was a matter of theoretical rather than practical concern. Privies were shared, one toilet serving perhaps 20 families. They were never cleaned. The streets themselves served as open sewers. In summer, the smell was so overwhelming that visitors from better neighborhoods would cover their faces with handkerchiefs soaked in perfume. Disease, under such conditions, was not an accident. It was inevitable. Cholera, typhoid, typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery. These were not rare visitors to the poor neighborhoods of London. They were residents, permanent residence, and in certain years, in certain streets, they killed more people than employment killed, which is to say they killed more people than anything except pure destitution. And yet, within this apparatus of suffering, there existed something that the reformers and social investigators of the era struggled to understand. There existed joy, not the refined joy of the upper classes, but something rawer, more precious, because it had to be fought for against such odds. In the evenings, in certain streets, one could hear music, singing, the sound of human community persisting despite the machinery designed to crush it. The pub was, for many, the only warm place they could afford to sit. A pint of ale or porter cost a penny. For that penny, you could sit for hours in relative warmth and light. It was not a luxury so much as a necessity for sanity. In the pub, you were not alone. You were among people who understood, without explanation, what your day had been. In these pubs, you could find the entire spectrum of working-class London. The honest labourer who had worked a 12-hour day and wanted nothing more than to rest. The casual worker with no work that day, fighting despair with alcohol. The petty criminal, discussing the day's business. The prostitute, between clients, stealing a few moments of prostitution in Victorian London was not hidden, as polite society might have wished. It was visible and ubiquitous. Young women, often fleeing abuse or destitution, sold their bodies because it was the only commodity they possessed that had immediate market value. A woman might earn in an hour what a factory worker earned in a week, but the price paid was not merely physical. There were, in London in the 1870s, approximately 80,000 prostitutes. This figure is from police estimates and is almost certainly conservative. They ranged in age from children as young as 12 to women in their 40s. They worked in every neighbourhood, but were concentrated in certain streets that everyone knew, and which no respectable person admitted to knowing. For many of these women, disease was a constant companion. Syphilis, gonorrhea, these were not moral failings in the Victorian conception, they were occupational hazards. They were expected. A woman might work for a few years, contract disease, and then become unemployable for any work other than the most degraded. She would become, quite literally, a person whom no one would touch. Yet even in this abyss, there were some who attempted to extend compassion. Not the grand charitable gestures of the wealthy. Those were often more about the donor's sense of virtue than the recipient's need. But small acts, a woman sharing her meager food, a man offering his coat, the simple acknowledgement that another human being existed and mattered. The children born into these circumstances were, in a sense, the truest reflection of the system's indifference. They were born expecting nothing and received nothing. Their childhoods were stolen, not by villains, but by economic necessity. At 5, they might begin working. At 10, they were experienced labourers. At 15, they were already worn down by labour in a way that would define them for life. The death rate among children in the poorest neighbourhoods of London was staggering. Nearly half of all children born to poor parents did not survive to the age of 10. Infants died of diseases that better-fed children survived easily. Malnutrition made children susceptible to every passing illness. And the mothers, often pregnant again and again, worn out by childbirth and poverty, could do little to prevent it. In 1872, the reformer Henry Mayhew was conducting his interviews among the London poor, asking them to describe their lives. But Mayhew was not discovering anything new. The poor knew their own suffering. It was the rich who did not know, or who knew and chose not to acknowledge. The distance between classes in Victorian London was not merely economic. It was moral, social, and psychological. A wealthy person and a poor person did not merely occupy different parts of the city. They inhabited different realities. They believed different things about why the poor were poor. They imagined different futures. In some sense, they were different species, occupying the same geography. The wealthy believed, or told themselves, that poverty was a result of moral failure, that the poor were lazy, drunken, lustful, and immoral, that poverty was deserved. This belief had several useful properties. It justified the absence of aid, it explained suffering without requiring action, and it allowed the wealthy to see the system itself as just, with only individual failures marring it. The poor, for their part, accepted much of this moral framework, even as they lived within it. They had internalized the idea that poverty was shameful, and that pauperism was a kind of moral disease. This made resistance difficult. How do you rebel against a system that has convinced you that your suffering is your own fault? And yet resistance existed. Not always in the form of organized political movements, though those existed too. Often, it was simply the act of persisting, of maintaining dignity in the face of a system designed to strip it, of laughing when you should have wept, of singing in the pub despite everything, of sharing food when you were hungry, of loving despite circumstances that made love seem foolish. In 1888, 16 years after the period we are examining, a series of murders would occur in Whitechapel. The killer, known as Jack the Ripper, would murder at least 5 women, all of them poor, many of them prostitutes. The murders would shock the world, and not because poor women were being killed, they died regularly, but because the murders were sensational, theatrical, and unsolved. The Ripper murders, in a strange way, brought temporary attention to the conditions of the poor. Suddenly, the wealthy were asking, how could such a place exist in their city? But the attention did not last. Within years, the problem was forgotten again. The streets of Whitechapel returned to their previous invisibility, and the poor returned to their previous irrelevance. What is remarkable about the 1870s is not that such suffering existed. Human suffering has always existed. What is remarkable is that such suffering could exist in the richest, most powerful city in the world, and be so thoroughly ignored by those with the power to change it. The contradiction was not a flaw in the system, it was the system itself. The reforms that would eventually come, child labor laws, sanitation improvements, public health measures, would come slowly and against fierce resistance. The wealthy did not want to pay higher taxes to improve conditions for the poor. Factory owners did not want to reduce hours or improve safety. And so, the system persisted, killing and maiming and degrading, until the cost of maintaining it became higher than the cost of changing it. The people who lived through the 1870s in the slums of London did not know that conditions would improve. For them, the present moment was all there was. The future did not promise change, it only promised more of the same. And yet they lived, they loved, they found moments of joy, they persisted. This persistence in the face of hopelessness is perhaps the most human thing we can do. The children we see working in these streets, the women we see standing in doorways, the men we see trudging to factory gates, they would eventually die and be forgotten. Their names are not recorded. Their stories were not deemed worth preserving. History was written by the wealthy and the powerful, and in that history, but the poor were largely invisible except when they threatened order. And yet they matter, not because history will remember them, but because they lived, because they were conscious, feeling human beings whose suffering was real, whose joy was genuine, whose loves and struggles and small victories were not less important because they were unrecorded. To witness their lives, even through the filter of time and representation, is to honor a kind of human dignity that no social system can actually destroy, only temporarily obscure. The streets of London in the 1870s would eventually transform. The tenements would come down. Sanitation would improve. Wages would rise. The worst horrors would become less frequent. But the fundamental machinery, the system that concentrates wealth and power while distributing poverty and powerlessness, would persist, taking new forms, moving to new places, finding new ways to dehumanize. What the people of Victorian London could not have known is that their suffering was not inevitable. It was chosen. By a system, by individuals, by the refusal to imagine differently. That knowledge, the knowledge that things could always be otherwise, is perhaps the only thing we inherit from their history.